Hi, my name's James Cook. I'm an assistant professor of social science at the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video for Soc 101, Introduction to Sociology. Let's get started. This video is meant for the beginning of the semester, when we're just getting to know each other, and you're just getting to know the idea of sociology. If you're taking a sociology class, you may be asking yourself, what am I doing here? What am I going to be studying? Your textbook author, Dalton Conley, I don't think is helping you, because his definition of sociology is, quote, the study of human society. Now, I don't know about you, but when I took an English class, when I was in college, they taught me that when you define a term, you should not make a trivial definition. A trivial definition is a definition that includes the word you're defining in the definition itself. So if I told you that the definition of sandwich is a sandwich-like thing, then you would say, well, you didn't tell me anything. If I told you that a wall is a thing that is wall-like, then you would say, tell me more. So to say that sociology is the study of human society is to do little more than engage in a little etymology. You have to know that ology means the study of, and that socio refers to society. Oh gosh. In other words, the study of society is the study of society. That doesn't tell you anything. Any more than to know that biology is the study of life. Or that geology is the study of rocks. In order to really understand what that means, right, you have to understand what a rock is. In order to understand what biology is, you have to understand what life is. And so in each of those classes, you have to come to terms with what that object is. Similarly, if we really want to come at a good definition, a working definition, a non-trivial definition of what sociology is, you have to figure out what society is. So that's one of the things I want to do in this video. The second thing I want to do in this video is to talk about the way in which sociology, so familiar to us, is not simply a matter of common sense and is not a matter of the obvious. You may think you know society, but you may not know society as well as you think you do. This is one of the things I want to demonstrate throughout the course of the semester. And that's why it's very important to engage in careful study of society, systematic study of society, which is what sociology is. So I'd like to start this video by thinking about an advertisement about our university, University of Maine at Augusta. Now this is an advertisement you see here for our Bangor campus from a few years back, in which a student is quoted, this is taken directly from a newspaper, quoted saying, that thing they tell you, you can do whatever you want to do, it's true. And I learned that here. Whatever your dreams, whatever you want to do, you can do it. I want you to consider, do you agree or do you disagree with that statement? Now, it turns out that in past semesters, about 2/3 of Introduction to Sociology students have raised their hand to say, yeah, I agree with that. 2/3. About 1/3 doesn't. I want to make the argument that this is American individualism at work. We believe in the United States, in our culture, in the potential of the human spirit. We have a can-do philosophy. But if we take that statement literally, whatever you want to do, well, there's some problems with that. Consider what you might want to do. You might want to fly. Can you fly? You might want to walk through walls. Can you do that? Some of you may be reacting right now and saying, oh, that's not fair. That's trivial. We all know you can't do that. That wasn't what we meant, right? But why? Because those were considered to be obvious aspects of reality. There are certain things you can't do. Why? Why can't you walk through walls? Why can't you fly? Okay. Well, you could walk through a wall if it's a very thin one, but if it's a thick one, and you consider why that is, and you look into it, you might say, well, there are these things called atoms, right? And atoms consist of protons and neutrons, and they have electrons whirring around them, and those electrons have electromagnetic repulsion, and they repel each other, and they make objects feel solid, so you cannot punch through a wall. And it's because of the electrons repelling each other. Ask a physicist, that's what 9 out of 10 physicists will tell you. Why can't you fly? Gravity. That's the answer that most people will give. You know, think about that. Most physicists will tell you gravity exists. But have you ever seen gravity? Have you ever seen an atom? Ever seen an electron? Have you ever seen electromagnetic repulsion and the electromagnetic force that is behind it? I'm going to wager you haven't. You haven't actually seen these things. Gravity is this invisible thing, right? Atoms are too small to see. Electrons, for quantum mechanical reasons, cannot be seen. You can't both fix its location and its direction. You try to observe it and it goes flying off. So you can't see these things, right? Think about that for a minute. You have physicists telling you, well, now, the reason that things happen is because of invisible things you can't see, and you have to trust us that they exist, right? Sounds a little fishy, doesn't it? And yet, if I ask you right now, do you believe in gravity? Do you believe in the solidity of a wall? Do you believe that electrons and atoms exist? I would wager most of you would agree. So why? I'm going to make a claim, and that claim is that something feels real to us. We accept that something exists if it is real in its consequences. So gravity has obvious consequences. Objects falling to Earth. You try to fly off a cliff, you're going to fall. No matter how much you want to fly. Unless you strap something to your back to defy gravity and counter it with something else, you will fall again and again and again. And we know this to be true. Why? Because we've seen it happen. You take a toddler does not accept gravity, right? This is one of the dangers of a toddler. They will throw themselves off walls if you let them, which is why we have to have parents to keep kids from trying out a deadly gravity experiment. Ignore gravity and it'll kill you. We can observe other consequences of gravity. Gravitational lensing, which is this feature in which if there's a black hole in between a star and the Earth, well, it'll turn the deflected light into an arc of light that's many, 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 many light years across. We can also watch planetary orbits. That's an observable consequence. We accept gravity as being real because it has real observable consequences. We can say the same thing about a wall, right? The theory of a wall, the idea, the account, the argument about the existence of walls is that it involves electrons and electromagnetic repulsion. And that theory, although it involves invisible things you can't see, we accept as true and real because it has real consequences. It works. You try to run your head through a wall sometime, and you'll find out that there is a solidity there. There is a solidity there. But what makes that wall a wall? This is the second thing we have to consider, right? If we're thinking about an object that we accept as real and a force that we accept as real, the solidity of a wall, what makes it a wall? What makes that thing real? Well, a wall is not a wall because of the stuff that makes it up. The wall behind me is made of plaster, but it's not plaster that's necessary to make a wall. You could have a wall made out of brick or stone or wood, cardboard even. You could make a cardboard wall. You could have a plastic wall and it would still be a wall. So if it's not the stuff that makes it up, what is it? If we think about a chair, right? You may be sitting in a chair right now. What makes that chair a chair? Look at your chair. It's not the substance that makes it up, is it? You could have a stone chair, you could have a plastic chair, a wood chair, even a styrofoam chair, and we would recognize it as a chair if it had the right structure. Just as we would recognize a wall if it had the right structure. Now, what is structure? Okay. Structure is the arrangement of those physical objects. A wall is something that is perpendicular to a floor and also perpendicular to a ceiling, existing between a floor and a ceiling. That's what makes a wall a wall. A chair is a set of objects, including a seat that is roughly perpendicular to a seat back, and that is also perpendicular to a set of legs. The legs are below the seat, and the back is above the seat. If you have that, you have a chair. If you don't have that, you don't have a chair. Right? So that physical structure is meaningful, right? And it also has a physical purpose. A chair is for something. You are supposed to do something with it, right? It has a function. The function is to sit in, to put your behind in, so you don't have to stand all the time or sit on the floor. Well, so we might think about social reality. I want to argue with you in this class that we consider something to be socially real if it is real in its consequences, number one. I want to talk about social objects, and I want to say we can recognize them according to their structure, that is, how the elements of them are arranged together in some kind of regular pattern, and how those objects serve a function, right? So the last thing, if we say then that the study of society is going to involve looking at consequences, structures, and functions of these social objects that we'll talk about, the last thing to figure out is, well, what does social mean? Social is the stuff of society. It's an adjective describing a society, and it refers to objects, usually human beings, in interaction. Interaction can mean association, belonging to. It can mean membership. It can mean communication, talking. It can mean interaction. But it is some form of interaction, whether by belonging, by interacting, by cooperating, by conflicting, in which there are individual objects that have a structure together, a structure in which they interact to make something bigger than themselves. Those objects are typically people in sociology when we begin, and those small objects work together in interaction to make structures called groups. Those groups work together in interaction to make structures called institutions. Those institutions build up to communities. Those communities have cultures. Together, they make the largest structure of all, a society. This is the meaning of sociology. Sociology is the study of objects in interaction, their structure, their function, and that's what we want to study in this course. This means that we could be talking about individual people, and we could talk about how it is that a person is created through interaction. We could talk about circles of friends. We could talk about community groups and how they work. As sociologists, we can study neighborhoods. We could study trade associations. We could study countries, entire countries. We could study international relations. Sociologists can do many things, but in all of these, and in all of the kinds of interaction that we study among these objects, we are always studying individual units in interaction, and that is what makes sociology distinct. That is the study that we call sociology. So when we engage in that study, we want to do what any scientific enterprise, an enterprise building knowledge, wants to do, which is to accumulate understanding. In our case, in sociology, we want to accumulate social facts. What is a social fact? Well, let's go back. It has to do with consequences of behavior. It has to do with interaction between objects and the particular structure of interaction. When we see those structures of interaction, we find regular consequences, regular patterns, and those form social facts. Ways of interaction that regularly occur and reoccur so that we can come up with rules to describe them. There's an old dead sociologist, he's a classic one, Émile Durkheim, French sociologist, who, a century and a half ago now, put it this way. He said, a social fact is any way of acting, whether fixed or not, that is capable of exerting over the individual an external constraint, and that it has an existence of its own independent of the individual. So, this is a feature of a social fact, that a social fact must be true no matter what's going on inside the individual unit that is interacting, right? A social fact exists no matter what an individual human being wants, no matter what they desire, no matter what they hope for, no matter what they dread. We don't study what's inside. Psychologists do that. Sociologists study what's happening outside, how these individual units interact with one another, and how those interactions create a social reality, a consequence that is unavoidable and that occurs regularly, regardless of what happens on the inside. That is a social fact. And I want to argue that these social facts are just as real as physical facts. Why? Because they are just as consequential. Because they constrain your life just as much. So here are 3 social facts that I want to start off with. The first one is discovered by a sociologist named Scott Feld. And his social fact says simply that your friends have more friends than you do. This sounds like a paradox. It sounds impossible, but it is true. Here, I challenge you. Take a look at this social network, okay, in which there are individual units, these dots called nodes in social science, and let's imagine they're people. Let's imagine that these lines between 2 people, called ties, indicate that those people are friends. Now, let's further imagine that we could figure out how many friends any one node has. The red person, the red node, has 1 friend, purple. Purple has 2 friends. They are, you can follow the ties, they are green and red. Green has a lot of friends. They are purple, yellow, orange, and blue. That's 4 friends. So we can tally up how many friends each person has. Scott Feld showed that on average, any person's friends will tend to have more friends than they do. I challenge you to figure out how and why, and I will present the proof for that in our next lecture. But see if you can show why that is true in this case. I want to show you another social fact. This one was discovered by a sociologist named Peter Blau, and it is that minorities have a higher rate of intergroup relations than majorities do. Now, we can define minorities and majorities in terms of power, but we can also define them in terms of number, and we're going to define a majority and a minority in terms of number here. A majority is a group that has more people in it. A minority is a group that has fewer people in it. And Peter Blau discovered in the 1970s that if you have a smaller group and there are any interactions at all between the smaller group and the larger group, the smaller group will have a higher rate of intergroup association. In this example, we have reds and greens, okay? There doesn't need to be anything special about what's inside these individual units, right? We don't need to know what red means. We don't need to know what green means. All we need to know is that there are reds and greens. And what do we know? Well, we know that 1 out of 2 reds is associating with a green. We know that 1 out of the 4 greens is associating with a red. Which is a higher rate? Well, 1/2 is higher than 1/4. The minority member is more likely to associate with a majority member than vice versa. I challenge you. This is a second challenge. See if you can find any exceptions to this social fact. Try adding ties. Try taking ties away. And as long as there is one tie between groups, as long as there is one, as long as there are any intergroup ties at all, then this social fact holds. See if you can disprove it. I think you may not be able to. And it doesn't depend on psychology. It doesn't depend on what you want. Social fact number 3. This is the Thomas theorem, named for W.I. Thomas and Dorothy Swain Thomas, way back in 1928. They created the Thomas theorem, which states that if men, or we could say now people, define situations as real, those situations are real in their consequences. This is true even if our observations contradict the way that people define situations. Even if people believe something that we think is not true, they create a reality to that situation that has an observable consequence. If we believe aliens are coming to the Earth tomorrow, and we believe it truly and strongly and widely and deeply in our culture, that belief will have consequences. This is something we'll be talking about, a social fact we'll be describing when we think about culture and we think about socialization. It is more complicated than the prior 2 social facts, but it is no less real. Social scientists Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jackson found that when they took a classroom and they randomly identified students as being exceptional performers at the beginning of the semester and told teachers this, even when it had nothing to do with the student's actual record, those randomly selected students did better than their peers. Why? Because the understanding of reality by the teacher had real consequences. Those students were paid more attention to. They were treated as if they were more intelligent, and they ended up acting as if they were more intelligent, as if they were more exceptional. Exceptionality comes in our treatment of students as exceptional. It's a consequence. And it was not based in any pre-existing reality, but Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson were able to create that reality as a consequence. Thomas theorem enacted 3 social facts. Some of you may be thinking at this point, oh, well, that's all obvious. I already knew that. Or this is something that anybody could figure out. Anybody could know. Well, Isaac Newton gets the same rap with gravity. Everybody says, oh, everybody knows about gravity. Well, we forget, first of all, that there was a time when people did not understand gravity. It used to be obvious that objects fell to Earth because they had an affinity for the Earth. They were fond of it. They liked the Earth. Certain objects were really, close and chummy with the Earth, and that's why they came down, right? It was not that there was any kind of physical force. It was because they liked the Earth, and that was obvious for a time. Sometimes we believe things to be obvious when they're not so. Now, there are some other reasons why we might want to distrust the obvious. The notion that there is this common sense out there that everybody knows, and that is this reality that you don't need to spend time studying. Sometimes we hold certain common sense ideas to be true, and we have more than one of them, and they actually contradict one another. Consider 2 phrases. Birds of a feather flock together. It's a cliche. Oh, how cliched could you get? But we have another cliche that we say often. We say opposites attract, right? These are two cliches, two popular sayings, two pieces of common sense. And if you think about it for a minute, they can't both be true. One of them's got to be wrong. How do we figure out which one's right? Well, we have to observe the world around us. We have to observe the social world, and we have to observe interaction, because those are actually claims about social structures of interaction. In a social scientific way, we would say that birds of a feather flock together means that individuals who are tied to each other, who communicate with each other, tend to be more alike than different. Opposites attract, we would predict the opposite. We would say that people who are in interaction tend to differ from one another more than we would expect by chance alone. We can go test that. People have, and I'm going to share the results with you during this semester. I want to present a third reason very quickly why you might want to distrust what seems obvious to you, what seems like common sense. The word, or the phrase rather, common sense, contains the word sense, our sensation. And although sociology is distinct and different from psychology, we do take some insights from psychology. Psychologists have discovered that our senses are not necessarily to be trusted. There are a number of ways in which we perceive the world around us in very inaccurate ways, ways that just aren't so. I want to share a few of those with you right now. One of these biases is called anchoring. An anchoring bias is a bias that occurs, it's been studied, and it occurs when we first get one piece of information, and then we get a second piece of information that contradicts the first. Which one do we believe? We tend to believe the first piece of information we get. And as a consequence, what we learn early in life, even when it is patently contradicted by what we learn later in life, we tend to hold on to very strongly. That's a bias. It makes what we think about the world possibly quite inaccurate. Conformity bias. We're going to take some time to actually study this, a whole week to study social conformity. Conformity happens when I say something and somebody else says something and it's the same thing. 6 or 7 other people say something, and then it's your turn to agree or disagree. Conformity bias means that you are disproportionately likely to agree. If there's an authority figure that's telling you what the definition of the situation is or what you ought to do, you are especially likely to go along, even when it turns out that what you're doing is based on falsehood, or it is based on a contradiction of what you believe inside yourself to be true. That's conformity bias, and it also affects the way we perceive the world. There's this bias called consciousness bias. It's also known as anthropomorphization. It is the tendency for people to see in inanimate objects consciousness. We see an object with a face, and we find it more difficult to hit, more difficult to hurt. Take the face away, consciousness bias goes away. We are more likely to be willing to hurt it. This is a subset of a more general bias called pareidolia. Pareidolia is this really interesting phenomenon in which we tend to look at often random objects and we see things in them that are not there. But once you see them, we look for them, often faces, right? Once you see a face, you can no longer make the face go away, and we treat it, therefore, as if it is something real. There's a really neat Twitter feed. Twitter is a form of social media, and it's called Faces in Things. And in Faces in Things, the Twitter feed consists of nothing more than a series of photographs in which there's something that looks like something. It's not really there, but if we think of it and look at it like that thing is really there, all of a sudden We can't think of the photo in any other way. So we see ducks in clouds. We see baby faces on knees, right? We see a crying person in a cucumber. That's a form of bias. Another form of bias is framing bias. The tendency to believe what we're told when information is limited. Now, a classic way of doing this is to take, in a graph, an x-axis or a y-axis, and to truncate it, to chop it off. I'm showing, attached to this video, two graphs of the same phenomenon. Stocks. Are the stocks shooting up in a wild fashion, or are they stable? Are they mostly staying the same? The answer depends on how you use the frames of an x-axis and a y-axis. If I chop off one axis, I can make a relatively stable period look like it's suffering wild change. There is homophily bias, the fact that we tend to associate with one another when we are like one another, when we are akin, when we are similar in some fashion. Birds of a feather do flock together, it turns out. Opposites do not attract. And what that means is that when we create our social reality, when we associate with one another, when we communicate with one another, we build meaning together. We build this whole idea of common sense. And who is it that we build this idea of common sense with? People who are very much like us. Sunday is the most segregated day in America by race and also by religion. And it consists of people meeting in a room and deciding what reality is. Coming to a sense of conformity on that. And then moving out and having their common sense built on social similarity, so that you have different churches in America leading to very different understandings of what common sense is. And that's just churches. I mean, if we start to think about synagogues and mosques, other religious groups, and then the groups of those who are not religious at all, who also associate with one another disproportionately, we have groups of people in the United States who believe very different things are common sense. This is a bias. This is a problem if we think that common sense is an accurate reflection of the world around us. A final bias, and there are many, many of these, but the last one I'll present today is of selective perception bias, the tendency for our expectations to affect perception. Now, attached to the lecture that I'm presenting today at wpsites.maine.edu/introduction to sociology, I've appended another video. And that video is by a pair of social psychologists, Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris. And they have an experiment which involves counting the number of times a basketball has been passed between certain people. I would like you to watch that video, and then I would like you to look at what you see, and then think about what you didn't see, because there's something in that video most people did not see. In conclusion, our common sense about society, about individual objects that interact with one another and create structures, and then create social facts and rules, our common sense about what those rules are is subject to a number of biases. Those biases mean that often what we think of as an intuitive understanding of what the world is just plain wrong. It means that it's important to actually study society systematically, study it from above, and adopt methods that try to take those biases away. That is what sociology is. That is what social scientists and sociologists in particular try to do. Because we're not, as individuals, accurate observers. We're not accurate reporters. The stories we tell that are informal are not trustworthy. And so social science has a role to play in countering that. When we do that, we try to come up with a rigorous understanding of the consequences of social facts for the world. We try to understand what different kinds of social structures exist And when we put those understandings of social structures and their consequences together, we have a discipline called sociology. Welcome to sociology. This is our semester.